The air in Bernardet West's hospital room was thick with the quiet hum of machines, each beep, each sigh from the ventilator, marking another passing moment of her short life. At 43, Bernardet had lived a life that many would envy, but the illness that ravaged her body had drained her of all the vibrancy she once exuded. Once, she was the star of the room, the woman everyone admired. But now, lying in a sterile bed with the faint smell of antiseptic, she was a shadow of the woman who once graced magazine covers, commanded attention, and lived on her own terms. Her husband, Thomas West, sat in a chair at her bedside, his eyes fixed on the floor, barely acknowledging her presence. His professional life as a corporate lawyer had kept him distant, emotionally absent for much of their marriage. Thomas was a man of few words, preferring to bury his emotions behind the walls of his career. He was the perfect counterpart to Bernardet's glamorous, often reckless lifestyle. The years of living together had created a chasm between them that no amount of beauty or wealth could bridge. Now, in these final days, he seemed more a stranger than a husband. Every now and then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, signaling the arrival of Bernardet's friends Annabelle and Vivien. The two women were as different as night and day. Annabelle, the free-spirited art gallery owner, was as wild and unpredictable as Bernardet had been in her youth. Vivien, on the other hand, was calm and measured, a therapist who had always known how to calm Bernardet's emotional storms. The trio shared a history laced with passion, secrets, and regrets. Today they were all here, drawn together by Bernardet's illness. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Each woman knew that their time together was slipping away, but none of them could truly face what had always lingered between them: guilt, desire, and the haunting specter of choices long past. As Bernardet shifted in her bed, she knew that time was running out for the confession she had long been too afraid to make. With a deep breath, Bernardet broke the silence. "I've made so many mistakes," she said softly, her voice fragile but determined. Her gaze shifted between Annabelle and Vivien, seeking something in their eyes, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps just understanding. "There's so much I need to say before it's too late." The room seemed to grow colder as Bernardet's thoughts wandered, pulling her back to a time when she was full of life, when the world was at her feet, and her beauty was her greatest weapon. She remembered those days clearly, as if they were just yesterday. At 23, she had been at the peak of her modeling career, an international sensation. The world loved her, but it wasn't just her looks that kept her in the spotlight. It was her ability to charm anyone she wanted, to make them feel like they were the most important person in the room. But behind the allure and the glamour, there had always been something more, something darker. Bernardet had never been content with just being admired. She needed control, power, and validation. She had known from a young age how to manipulate those around her to get what she wanted, whether it was attention, affection, or something more. Thomas, her husband, was no exception. When they met, he was everything she needed: stable, successful, and willing to do anything to keep her happy. But despite his love and devotion, Bernardet had always felt something missing. The thrill of his love was comforting, but not enough to quench her need for excitement. Enter Henry, a wealthy businessman who had been drawn to her from the moment they met. Bernardet had never planned to fall into an affair, but one night during a glamorous event, Henry had whispered the right words in her ear, and she had fallen into his arms. She had kept the affair a secret, of course. No one could know about her betrayal, especially not Thomas. She couldn't bear the thought of losing the stability he provided, even as she craved the thrill that Henry gave her. The affair had continued for years, hidden beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life. And as Bernardet lay in her hospital bed now, looking at Thomas, she realized just how far she had pushed the boundaries of love, loyalty, and truth. The weight of those secrets was suffocating. It wasn't just the affair with Henry that haunted her, it was everything else she had done to maintain the illusion of a perfect life, manipulating her friends, her husband, and herself. Bernardet had always believed that beauty could get her anything, but now, in the face of death, she saw how fleeting that belief had been. As she glanced at her reflection in the small mirror above the bed, she saw not the woman who had once captivated an entire world, but a woman who was facing the consequences of a life lived on the edge. Was it worth it? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that she needed to make things right if only she had more time. The door creaked open, and Bernardet's breath caught in her chest as Annabelle and Vivien stepped into the room. Despite the years that had passed, they hadn't changed much. Annabelle, with her wild red hair and bright green eyes, still carried the air of someone who never quite fit into the world's expectations. Vivien, the more composed one, was dressed in muted colors, her quiet confidence radiating in the space. Both women were pillars from Bernardet's past, the kind of friends who had witnessed the highs and lows of her journey. Annabelle smiled warmly as she walked toward the bed, her steps hesitant yet filled with affection. She leaned down to kiss Bernardet on the forehead. "You look beautiful," even now Annabelle said softly, though the sorrow in her voice was unmistakable. Vivien stood by the window, her expression unreadable as she observed the room. Her eyes lingered on Thomas, who still hadn't moved from his chair. The tension between them was palpable, as if the years of silence had etched deep scars into their relationship. Vivien and Thomas had never been close, but there was a history there, a history no one ever spoke of. As Bernardet lay there, weak and fragile, she couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for her friends. Despite everything, despite the lies, the betrayals, and the distance they had all put between each other, here they were, together again. For a moment, Bernardet allowed herself to relive the memory of their younger days, when the three of them had been inseparable. There had been laughter, adventure, and a sense of invincibility. But those days were gone, replaced by something far more complex. "Are you all right?" Vivien finally asked, her voice a soothing balm to Bernardet's frazzled nerves. Her clinical, no-nonsense tone had always had a grounding effect on Bernardet. It was why she had trusted Vivien with so many of her secrets over the years. Bernardet hesitated, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. "No," she said simply. "I'm not all right." Annabelle sat down beside her, taking her hand gently. "We're here now, Bernardet. You don't have to go through this alone." A long silence followed, heavy with unspoken words. The truth was, Bernardet didn't know how to make peace with the past. There were things she needed to say, secrets she needed to confess, but how could she ask for forgiveness when she hadn't even forgiven herself? "I'm sorry," Annabelle Bernardet whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've influenced your life in ways I shouldn't have. I pushed you into things you weren't ready for. I was selfish, and I'm sorry." Annabelle blinked, startled by the sudden apology. She squeezed Bernardet's hand, her voice soft but steady. "Bernardet, we all make choices, and we all have to live with them. You're not the only one who's made mistakes. We're here now, all of us together." For a fleeting moment, Bernardet felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time to set things right. The weight of Bernardet's words hung in the air like a delicate thread, ready to snap at any moment. She had spent years buried in her own world, consumed by her desires and her need for control, and now, in the quiet of this hospital room, she could no longer escape the truth. Annabelle's face softened, but there was a flicker of something more, something deeper in her eyes, the kind of sadness that only time could bring. "Bernardet, we've been through a lot together," Annabelle said quietly. "You didn't force me into anything. I made my own choices." But Bernardet wasn't convinced. She knew, deep down, that she had played a role in shaping the path Annabelle had taken. She had always been the one to push, to nudge, to make things happen. It was part of who she was, always seeking control, always needing to be at the center of it all. Annabelle's choices, the reckless relationships, the dangerous decisions, Bernardet had been a catalyst in all of it. She had pushed Annabelle into a world of indulgence and excess, a world that had left her scarred. And now Bernardet had to face the reality that her influence had come at a cost. "Do you remember the night we went to that party?" Bernardet asked, her voice distant as she stared at the ceiling, lost in the memory. "The one where you met Henry?" Annabelle nodded slowly. "I remember." Bernadette's eyes darkened as she remembered the details of that night, the way Henry had looked at Annabelle, how she had known, deep down, that Annabelle would fall for him. The way Bernardet had encouraged it, knowing that it would make things complicated, knowing it would change everything. She had been selfish then, too. But now, in her final moments, she saw the truth for what it was. "I pushed you towards him," Bernardet admitted, the guilt pressing down on her chest like a heavy weight. "I thought it would be exciting, that it would make us all feel alive. But I never realized how much it would hurt you. I'm sorry." Annabelle squeezed her hand tighter, tears welling up in her eyes. "Bernardet, I don't blame you. We're all just people trying to figure it out as we go. We made mistakes, all of us. But we're here now, and that's what matters." Vivien, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "We all have our demons, Bernardet. But it's not too late to make peace with them. You've already done more than most would by being honest." Bernadette's breath caught as she felt a tear slip down her cheek. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of release, a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could finally find forgiveness, not just from her friends, but from herself. The room was quiet, save for the soft whir of the medical equipment and the occasional shuffle of feet. Bernardet could feel her strength slipping away with each passing moment. The pain had become a constant companion, gnawing at her, but it was the quiet anxiety gnawing at her heart that truly unsettled her. She could no longer avoid the reality that soon she would be gone, leaving behind not just her husband and friends, but a lifetime of tangled emotions and unresolved matters. As Annabelle and Vivien continued their conversation, Bernardet's eyes wandered to Thomas, who had still not spoken a word. He sat motionless in his chair, his face an unreadable mask. For so many years, Bernardet had convinced herself that his silence was a product of his distant nature, that he didn't care, that he was emotionally unavailable. But now, in her final days, it became clear that Thomas had simply been as trapped by their marriage as she had been. They were both prisoners of their own making, locked in a cycle of neglect, unspoken resentments, and painful truths. The thought of leaving Thomas behind, unprepared for the life that would come after her death, tugged at Bernardet's heart. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone. But now, in these final moments, she saw just how much she had taken from him: the years of emotional neglect, the constant demands, the affairs, the manipulations. It was time to make it right, or at least try. With a hoarse voice, she spoke to Annabelle and Vivien, her words slow and deliberate. "I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, look after Thomas. He won't admit it, but he's lost. He always has been, but I never allowed him to find his way." Annabelle and Vivien exchanged glances, both sensing the weight of Bernardet's request. Vivien, ever the rational one, was the first to respond. "Bernadette, you know Thomas. He'll shut down. He'll push us away. But I'll be here. I'll make sure he has someone to turn to." Annabelle nodded, though there was hesitation in her eyes. She knew Thomas knew the walls he had built around himself, and though she had no love for him, she understood the importance of this final request. "I'll be there for him too, Bernardet. I promise." Bernadette sighed in relief. It wasn't a perfect solution. She knew that. But at least in some small way she could ease her conscience, knowing that her husband wouldn't be entirely alone when she was gone. It was the least she could do, the last thing she could offer. As her gaze shifted back to Thomas, she saw his eyes briefly meet hers. He didn't speak, but the sorrow that flickered in his gaze told her everything. She wasn't sure if he had ever truly loved her, or if it was just a need to hold on to something, anything, but now, with death looming closer than ever, she saw him not as her husband, but as a man who was also lost. Maybe they had both been lost all along, trying to find each other in a world that no longer made sense. The air grew thicker in the room as the conversation shifted from their past mistakes to the darker secrets they had all been keeping. Bernardet could feel the weight of everything she had hidden from the people she had once called her closest friends, secrets that had the potential to destroy everything, even now. As Bernardet's strength ebbed away, she found herself focusing on one secret that had haunted her for years, one that she had never dared to share with anyone: her affair with a man named Jared. He was married, with children, and yet, in the swirl of chaos that had been her life, He had become an undeniable part of it. Their affair hadn't started out of love or desire for something deeper. It was born from a need for validation, for something to fill the emptiness she often felt. But somewhere along the way, it had turned into something else, something that terrified Bernardet more than she was willing to admit. She had met Jared during one of the many charity galas she'd attended. A man of power, a businessman with a wife who was as cold and unapproachable as a stone statue. Jared's flattery had been intoxicating, and their affair had started with stolen kisses and late-night meetings. It had been thrilling at first, an escape from the confines of her marriage with Thomas. But as the affair continued, it became harder to compartmentalize. It wasn't just a physical fling, it was an emotional betrayal that Bernardet had tried to bury, to ignore, to justify. She had kept it secret, from Thomas, from Annabelle, and from Vivien. But now, in the final days of her life, the guilt was too much to bear. Her actions had hurt more than just her husband. They had hurt her friends too, especially Vivien, who had always preached loyalty and honesty. Annabelle, Bernardet whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something you need to know. About Jared." Annabelle looked at her, a mixture of confusion and concern clouding her face. "What about him?" Bernardet took a deep breath, her words coming out in a rush. "He's the one I had an affair with. For years. Behind Thomas's back. Behind all of your backs." There was a long, stunned silence. Vivien's face went pale, her expression unreadable as she processed Bernardet's confession. Annabelle, on the other hand, looked almost as though she had been slapped. You've been lying all this time?" Annabelle asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "To all of us." Bernardet nodded slowly, her face twisted with regret. "I was selfish. I never realized how much I was hurting all of you. But especially you, Annabelle. I dragged you into my world of lies and deceit, and I'm sorry." Vivien crossed her arms, her gaze steady but cold. "This is a lot, Bernardet. A lot to take in." She glanced at Annabelle, who was visibly shaken. "You've kept this hidden for years. Why tell us now?" Bernardet closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her actions settle deep into her chest. "Because it's time. I can't leave this world with these secrets anymore. You deserve to know the truth." The room was heavy with the gravity of Bernardet's confession. She had buried the truth for so long, but now, with time running out, she was forced to confront it. It was the only way to begin unraveling the tangled web of her life. But in doing so, she had risked alienating the very people who had once been her closest allies. The revelation of Bernardet's affair had left the room thick with silence. But that silence didn't last long. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and now all the buried truths, secrets, and past misdeeds were rising to the surface. The room felt smaller now, more confining, as the weight of Bernardet's confessions pressed down on everyone. As much as they had all tried to move on from the past, there were consequences to the things they had kept hidden, things that could shatter the lives they had built. Bernardet's confession about Jared was just the beginning. As the moment of stunned silence stretched on, Bernardet's mind raced. She knew there was more she needed to say, more that had been buried in the shadows, locked away in the recesses of her mind for far too long. It was time to face everything, to reveal the evidence that had the potential to ruin all of their lives. "Annabelle?" "Vivien," Bernardet began, her voice thick with emotion. "There's more you don't know. It's not just my affair. There's evidence that could destroy everything we've built. It's all tied to Jared, to his family. I don't know if you'll ever want to see it, but I need you to know it exists." Annabelle looked at her, confusion clouding her features. "What kind of evidence?" Bernardet hesitated, the room feeling even colder now, as the weight of the truth settled over them. Documents, photos, messages. Everything that proves the affair wasn't just a fleeting mistake. There are people involved, people with money, power. Things that could ruin reputations, careers. Jared's family is influential. And I was a part of that world for too long. I never meant to bring any of you into this." Vivien's expression darkened as she absorbed the information. "Are you saying there's a trail of evidence that could ruin us? Destroy our lives?" Bernardet nodded slowly, her heart heavy with regret. "Yes. And it's not just about me. It's about all of us. About things we did in the past, things I never thought would come back to haunt us. I kept it hidden because I was too afraid of the consequences. But now it's all coming to light. The lies, the manipulation, the risks we took. It could all be exposed. Annabelle stood up, pacing the small room. Why tell us this now, Bernardet? What do you want us to do with this information? I don't know, Bernardet said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do. All I know is that the truth is dangerous, and it's been eating away at me. I can't leave this world knowing that you're all carrying the weight of my lies. I want to set things right before it's too late. Vivien crossed her arms, her expression stern. So you want us to take care of this, whatever it is you've been hiding. Bernardet looked at her with desperate eyes. No, I don't expect you to fix this. I just want you to know. If anything happens, if someone comes after us with this information, I need you to be ready. We can't undo what's been done, but we can protect ourselves. The air was thick with tension as the three women sat in the dimly lit room, absorbing the enormity of the situation. It felt as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving them to navigate the fallout of a past that refused to stay buried. The consequences of Bernardet's actions were far-reaching, and no one knew exactly how deep the damage went. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. As the reality of Bernardet's situation began to settle in, there was a noticeable shift in the tone of the room. What had started as a simple, intimate gathering of old friends had transformed into something far more ominous. The space felt colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on Bernardet and her friends. The weight of their collective secrets, the buried truths, was suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked in the background, an almost eerie reminder of how little time Bernardet had left. She had opened the floodgates, but now the consequences were beginning to unfold before her eyes, and they were more complicated than she could have ever imagined. There were no simple answers, no quick fixes. The truth had been spilled, and the damage was already done. Annabelle and Vivien exchanged uneasy glances, each of them processing Bernardet's confession in their own way. What was meant to be a final chance for closure was quickly becoming a tangled web of guilt, fear, and uncertainty. They had once been close, a trio bound by history and shared experiences, but now, in the face of these revelations, they were forced to reckon with the cost of those years. Bernadette's mind raced. She knew that everything she had built, her reputation, her friendships, her marriage, was teetering on the edge of collapse. And as the reality of her impending death loomed closer, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own peace of mind, she was fighting to protect those she cared about most. The thought of leaving them with this burden, with the knowledge of what had transpired, was almost too much to bear. But there was no escaping it. No way to undo the damage that had been done. All Bernardet could do now was try to salvage whatever was left, to leave behind something, anything of value, before she was gone. Please, Bernardet whispered, her voice breaking. I'm asking you look after each other. When I'm gone, don't let this be the thing that tears us apart. We've been through so much together, and I don't want this to be how we remember each other. Please, don't let it end this way. The three women were silent, the weight of Bernardet's plea hanging in the air. The room felt colder still, as if the shadows of their pasts had come to claim them, and they were all standing on the precipice of something they couldn't control. It was a moment of reckoning, a final, haunting moment before the end. As the weight of the past settled over them, the true gravity of Bernardet's situation became even more apparent. She had spent so much of her life trying to avoid confrontation with the truth, both in her relationships and with her own self. But in these final moments, she had no choice but to face the inevitable, the terminal illness that had slowly taken over her body, robbing her of time and forcing her to reckon with everything she had tried to ignore. Annabelle and Vivien sat in stunned silence, still reeling from the revelations that had been shared. They had known Bernardet was sick, of course. They had seen her health deteriorating over the past few months. But the truth had always been something unspoken, an uncomfortable subject that hovered in the background. Her diagnosis, a cruel and rapid illness that no one had expected, had caught everyone off guard. At just 43 years old, Bernardet was dying. There were no more surgeries, no more treatments to try. She had long since exhausted the possibilities. The hospital room, sterile and cold, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could, for the first time in years, fully confront the end of her life. But facing that finality was harder than she could have imagined. The truth of her condition hit harder than any of the emotional betrayals she had endured. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Bernardet turned her eyes toward her friends. The strength she had always projected, the image of a woman who had everything under control, was crumbling. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to be this person, the one who leaves behind a mess, who causes so much pain. I thought I could fix things before it was too late, but now I see it's all slipping away." Annabelle, who had always been the pragmatic one, looked at Bernardet with a mix of sorrow and understanding. She reached out, taking her friend's hand gently. "Bernardet, you can't fix everything. You've already done more than most people ever could in a lifetime. But you don't have to do it alone. We're here for you now and after." Vivien nodded, her usual composure replaced with a softer, more compassionate expression. "You've been holding this weight for so long, Bernardet. You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore. We're all in this with you. Whatever happens, we'll be there to help you through it." The words were comforting, but Bernardet knew there was no way to stop the inevitable. The disease had already taken root, and soon her body would fail her completely. But in that moment, surrounded by the two people she had trusted most in the world, she allowed herself to feel a fleeting sense of peace. For once, she wasn't alone. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough to undo the damage of a lifetime of mistakes. As the hours slipped away, Bernardet's condition continued to worsen, her body betraying her as her time on Earth grew shorter. Her friends remained by her side, but the sense of finality in the room was suffocating. The conversations had turned from revelations to something much more intimate, more profound. In these last hours, there were no more games, no more pretenses. Every word was loaded with significance, with the understanding that soon it would all be over. Thomas had left the room for a while, needing space to process the weight of his wife's final moments. Bernardet's heart ached as she thought about the years they had spent together, the years she had squandered. She had never been able to give him what he needed, never been able to love him in the way he deserved. She had been too wrapped up in her own desires, too absorbed in her own world of secrets and lies. But now, at the end, she wished she had done things differently. She wished she could turn back time, undo the years of neglect and betrayal, and give him the love and attention he had always craved. But there was no turning back. Time was a luxury she had no more. In her weakened state, Bernardet called Annabelle and Vivien closer to her bedside. Her voice, a mere whisper, was barely audible as she spoke. I don't know how to say goodbye to you. I've never been good at it. But I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I'm grateful for everything you've given me. You've been the sisters I never had. I'm sorry for the secrets, for the things I kept from you. I never meant for any of it to end this way." Tears welled in Annabelle's eyes, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, squeezing Bernardet's hand tightly, as if trying to impart everything they had shared without the need for words. Vivien, though often the distant one, leaned forward, her eyes softening. "Bernadette," she said quietly, her voice cracking, "I don't know how to say this, but we've always known, even if you didn't think so. We knew there was more to you than you let us see. And I'm sorry we couldn't help more, but you're not alone, not now." It was in that moment, surrounded by her two closest friends, that Bernardet finally let go of the fear, the guilt, and the regret that had consumed her for so long. She had made her peace, at least in part. She had done what she could to make amends, to set things right before her time had run out. And now, as the shadows lengthened in the dim room, she could feel herself drifting, slowly but surely, toward the end. Her final words, whispered so faintly that they barely reached Annabelle and Vivien's ears, were simple but profound. "Thank you for everything, and take care of each other." The room fell into silence as Bernardet's breathing slowed, her body finally succumbing to the illness that had taken so much from her. In those final moments, there was no more regret, no more guilt, only the haunting realization that, in the end, the people who had mattered most to her were the ones who would carry her memory forward. And though she had made so many mistakes, she had found, in the end, the one thing she had always longed for: peace.